Every night at exactly midnight, a light appeared at the top of the abandoned lighthouse. 4 years, the people of the small coastal village wondered the same thing. Who was still climbing those old stone stairs? Who was still turning the ancient lamp toward the dark ocean? And why? After half a century, did the lighthouse keeper still wait? Most people believed the old man had lost something important. Maybe his memory. Maybe his sense of time. Maybe his connection to reality. Because everyone in the village knew one thing. Nobody came back from the sea after being gone for 50 years. Nobody. But every evening, as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon and the waves began their quiet song against the shore, Thomas Whitmore would walk slowly toward the lighthouse. A small lantern in his hand. A warm coat around his shoulders. And the same peaceful expression he had carried for decades. He never rushed. He never complained. And he never stopped looking toward the horizon. Because Thomas was not waiting for a ship. He was waiting for a promise. The lighthouse stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking a quiet stretch of ocean. It was older than anyone living in the village. Its white paint had faded. The metal railings had begun to show signs of rust. The wooden door creaked whenever the wind passed through. But to Thomas, it was not an old building. It was a place filled with memories. Every stone, every step, every corner of that lighthouse carried a piece of his life. When Thomas first arrived there, he was only 28 years old. A young man with more dreams than possessions. He had accepted the job of lighthouse keeper because he wanted a simple life. A quiet life. A life away from noise and crowds. Back then, the lighthouse was alive. Ships still passed through the waters regularly. Fishermen waved from their boats. Travelers stopped by the village. And every evening, someone somewhere depended on that light. Thomas loved knowing that. He loved that a small flame at the top of a tower could guide someone home. He often thought there was something beautiful about it. A person could be hundreds of miles away, lost in darkness, and still find their way because one small light refused to disappear. The villagers first noticed something different about Thomas one summer evening. It was the summer of 1974, a season when the ocean was calm and the nights felt endless. Thomas had been sitting outside the lighthouse, watching the sunset, when a young woman approached him. Her name was Eleanor. She had come to the village with her father, who was a sailor. Unlike most visitors, Eleanor wasn't interested in the ocean. She was interested in the stories behind it. She would sit near the harbor for hours, listening to fishermen talk about storms they survived, islands they discovered, and places they had never returned to. Thomas found that fascinating. Because he understood something about the sea. The ocean was not just water. It carried memories. It carried goodbyes. It carried dreams people were brave enough to chase. And sometimes, it carried people away. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Eleanor became close. They would walk along the cliffs after sunset. They would talk about everything. Their childhoods. Their fears. The places they wanted to visit. The lives they hoped to build. Eleanor loved the lighthouse. She said it reminded her of something. Thomas once asked her what. She smiled and said, "A lighthouse is proof that someone can still care about you, even when they can't see you." Thomas never forgot those words. One evening, as they watched the waves below the cliff, Eleanor told Thomas something she had never told anyone else. She wanted to travel. She wanted to see the world beyond the village. She wanted to discover places she had only read about in books. Thomas understood. Even though a part of him wished she would stay. Because sometimes, the hardest thing about loving someone is accepting that their dreams may take them somewhere you cannot follow. A few weeks later, Eleanor's father received an opportunity to join a long voyage across the Atlantic. It was the kind of opportunity sailors waited their entire lives for. But it meant leaving the village. And it meant Eleanor leaving too. The night before she left, she met Thomas at the lighthouse. The wind was cold. The ocean was restless. And neither of them wanted to say goodbye. They stood beneath the lighthouse beam, watching the light sweep across the dark water. Finally, Eleanor looked at Thomas and said, "Promise me something." Thomas smiled gently. "What?" If I ever find my way back here, make sure the light is still on. Thomas looked toward the lighthouse. Then back at her. I promise. Eleanor smiled. Even if it takes years. Thomas nodded. Even if it takes forever. The next morning, Eleanor left. And Thomas watched her boat disappear beyond the horizon. He expected her to return. Maybe after a year. Maybe 2. But years passed. And the ocean remained silent. Letters stopped arriving. The village changed. People grew older. The lighthouse became less important as new technology replaced the old lamp. Eventually, ships stopped needing Thomas. The lighthouse was officially closed. But Thomas stayed. And every night, he climbed those stairs. He cleaned the lens. He lit the lamp. And he kept his promise. Years passed quietly at the lighthouse. Not the kind of quiet that felt empty, but the kind of quiet that settles gently over old places. The kind of quiet where every sound has meaning. The sound of waves touching the rocks below. The sound of the wind moving through the cracks in the old wooden windows. The soft creaking of the lighthouse stairs as Thomas climbed them every evening. People in the village became used to seeing him. The old man with the lantern. The old man who walked the same path every night. The old man who still looked toward the sea. Some people admired him. Others felt sorry for him. They thought Thomas was trapped in the past. They thought he was holding on to something that was gone forever. But Thomas never saw it that way. He wasn't trapped. He was remembering. And there is a difference. Because memories are not always things that hold us back. Sometimes, they are the things that keep us moving forward. As the years went by, the village changed around him. The little fishing boats became fewer. The old wooden docks were replaced. The children who once played near the harbor grew up and moved away. The faces Thomas knew slowly disappeared. But the lighthouse remained. And so did the light. Every night at midnight, the same golden glow appeared above the cliffs. A small signal against the darkness. A quiet reminder that someone was still there. One autumn morning, Thomas found an old wooden box buried beneath a loose floorboard inside the lighthouse. He had lived there for decades, but somehow he had never noticed it before. Inside the box were small pieces of the past. An old pocket watch. A faded photograph. Several handwritten letters. And a small blue ribbon. Thomas picked up the photograph first. It was a picture of him and Eleanor. They were young. Almost unrecognizable compared to the people they had become. Thomas smiled. Back then, they had no idea what life would bring. They had no idea how quickly time could move. They had no idea that one simple promise would follow him for the rest of his life. That evening, Thomas sat beside the lighthouse window holding the photograph. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the fading sunlight. He wondered about Eleanor. Not with sadness. Not anymore. He wondered where she was. What kind of life she had lived. Whether she ever looked at the ocean and remembered this place. Whether she ever thought about the lighthouse. Whether she remembered his promise. Then Thomas looked at the lamp beside him. And he whispered softly, "I hope you found what you were looking for." The truth was, Thomas had stopped expecting Eleanor to return many years ago. At least, that was what he told himself. He no longer imagined footsteps approaching the lighthouse door. He no longer listened for boats arriving at the harbor. He no longer watched every ship passing in the distance. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of him still believed. Not because he thought she owed him anything. Not because he believed life had to follow the plans they made when they were young. But because some promises are not about the person who receives them. They are about the person who makes them. Thomas had promised to keep the light on. And keeping that promise had become part of who he was. Then came the night nobody expected. A night the villagers would talk about for years. A night when the ocean became unusually still. There was no storm. No heavy wind. No rain. Just a peaceful darkness covering the coastline. Thomas had finished preparing the lighthouse lamp. He checked the oil. Cleaned the glass. Adjusted the lens. Everything was exactly as it had been thousands of times before. He climbed the final steps toward the top of the tower. Slowly. Carefully. His hands were older now. His movements were slower. But the routine was still familiar. He reached the top, placed his hand on the old brass handle, and turned on the light. The beam moved across the ocean. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then Thomas stopped. Because something caught his attention. Far away. Beyond the waves. There was another light. A small light. Moving. At first, Thomas thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. After all, he was older. And the ocean was famous for creating illusions. But the light remained. It moved closer. Slowly. Steadily. A boat. A small boat. Coming toward the lighthouse. Thomas stood completely still. His heart began beating faster. Not because he knew who it was. But because something inside him suddenly felt familiar. Something he had not felt in years. Hope. The boat moved through the fog. The lighthouse beam followed it. With every passing minute, the shape became clearer. An old wooden boat. A single person standing at the front. Thomas held onto the railing. His hands began to shake. The boat reached the shore. The engine stopped. And for a moment, everything became silent. The only sound was the ocean touching the rocks. Then the person stepped onto the dock. Slow footsteps. A figure carrying a small bag. Someone who looked like they had traveled a very long way. Thomas walked down the lighthouse stairs. One step at a time. His mind filled with questions. Could it be? Was it possible? Or was his heart simply creating a memory from the past? The figure reached the lighthouse door. And stopped. For a few seconds, neither person moved. Then the stranger slowly lifted their face. And Thomas saw the eyes. Older. Different. But still familiar. A voice quietly spoke his name. Thomas. The lantern in his hand almost slipped. Because after 50 years. After countless nights. After a lifetime of waiting. He heard the voice he never thought he would hear again. Eleanor. For a moment. Neither of them spoke. After 50 years of imagining this moment, Thomas realized he had never actually imagined what he would say. He had imagined Eleanor returning. He had imagined seeing her face again. He had imagined hearing her voice. But he had never imagined what would come after. Because some moments are too big for words. Some reunions do not begin with long speeches. They begin with silence. The kind of silence that carries every year that came before it. Every memory. Every unanswered question. Every night spent wondering. Eleanor looked around the lighthouse. The same lighthouse where they had said goodbye all those years ago. The same walls. The same stairs. The same ocean outside the window. She smiled softly. You kept it. Thomas looked toward the lamp. Then back at her. I promised. Eleanor lowered her eyes. For a moment, Thomas noticed something he had not expected. Sadness. Not the sadness of someone returning to a place they loved. But the sadness of someone carrying a story they had been holding inside for far too long. They sat together in the small room beneath the lighthouse lamp. Two people who had lived an entire lifetime apart. Two people who had become strangers. And somehow still recognized each other. Thomas poured 2 cups of tea. His hands trembled slightly. Not because he was afraid. But because after all these years, he still couldn't believe she was sitting across from him. The person he had thought about on countless nights. The person whose memory had followed him through every season of his life. Finally, Thomas asked the question that had lived inside him for decades. Where did you go? Eleanor looked toward the ocean. And for a while, she said nothing. After leaving the village, Eleanor and her father had traveled farther than either of them expected. The voyage that was supposed to last a few months became longer. Then longer still. The world opened in ways she had never imagined. She saw cities filled with lights. Places where people spoke languages she had never heard. Landscapes that looked like paintings. She experienced a life she once dreamed about. But somewhere along the journey, everything changed. Her father became ill. The voyage ended sooner than expected. And Eleanor found herself responsible for taking care of the person who had spent his entire life taking care of her. Years passed. Then more years. Life became a series of responsibilities. A series of moments where returning home was always something she planned to do, but never something she managed to complete. "I wrote to you," Eleanor said quietly. Thomas looked surprised. "You did?" She nodded. "Many times." She reached into her bag. Inside was a collection of old envelopes. Hundreds of them. Thomas stared at them. His heart sank. "Why didn't I receive them?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because I sent them to the wrong place." Thomas looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The lighthouse." She looked around the room. "I kept sending letters here. But I didn't know the lighthouse had been closed. I didn't know the address had changed." She paused. "And after enough time passed, I thought maybe you had moved on." Thomas looked down. For years, he wondered if Eleanor had forgotten him. If the promise meant nothing to her. If he had been the only one holding on to the past. But now he understood. She had remembered too. The ocean had simply placed distance between them. Not because they stopped caring. But because life sometimes takes people along roads they never expected. "I should have come sooner," Eleanor whispered. Thomas shook his head. "No." She looked at him. "No." Thomas smiled gently. "Eleanor, look at us." He looked around the old lighthouse. 50 years have passed. We are not the same people who stood here that night. He paused. But somehow, this moment still found us. Outside, the lighthouse continued shining. Its golden beam moved slowly across the ocean. The same light Thomas had turned on thousands of times. The same light Eleanor had asked him to keep alive. But now, for the first time in decades, Thomas realized something. The lighthouse was never only about waiting for someone to return. It was about hope. It was about believing that even when something disappears into the darkness, it doesn't mean it is gone forever. They spent the next few days together. They walked along the cliffs. They visited the old harbor. They sat near the ocean and talked about the years they had missed. They talked about everything. The places Eleanor had seen. The people Thomas had met. The simple moments they both treasured. They laughed about the things they remembered differently. They cried about the things they wished had been different. And they forgave the things neither of them could control. One evening, as the sun began to disappear, Eleanor stood outside the lighthouse. She watched the waves below. "Do you ever regret staying?" Thomas thought about the question. A younger version of himself might have answered differently. But time changes people. Time teaches them what truly matters. Finally, he smiled. "No." Eleanor looked at him. "Not even once." Thomas looked at the lighthouse. "The light helped people find their way home." He looked back at her. "I think it helped me find mine too." That night, Thomas climbed the lighthouse stairs one final time. Eleanor followed behind him. Together, they reached the top. The ocean stretched endlessly before them. The stars filled the sky. Thomas placed his hand on the old lamp. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Would you like to turn it on?" She smiled. After 50 years. She finally touched the lighthouse light. Together, they turned it on. And the beam traveled across the water. Bright. Warm. Steady. Years later, people in the village would tell stories about the lighthouse. They would talk about the old keeper who never stopped lighting the lamp. They would talk about the woman who returned after half a century. They would talk about how some promises survive time. But the people who truly understood the story knew something deeper. The lighthouse was never waiting for a person. It was waiting for a moment. A moment when two lives that had taken different paths finally crossed again. And every night after that, the lighthouse still shined. But Thomas no longer stood there alone. Because sometimes, the thing we spend our whole lives waiting for is not a person, not a place, not a perfect ending. Sometimes, it is simply the peace that comes when we finally understand that everything happened exactly as it was meant to. So tonight, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying, remember the old lighthouse. Remember the light that stayed on through the darkest nights. Remember that even the longest journeys can have beautiful endings. And as the waves continue their gentle song, as the stars quietly watch over the world, allow yourself to rest. Allow your thoughts to become lighter. Allow the day to fade away. Because tomorrow will arrive when it is ready. But tonight, you can simply close your eyes and drift peacefully into sleep. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with Moonlight Tales. If this story brought you peace tonight, subscribe and join us again for another journey.